The moon was a cruel eye in the sky, cold and silver, watching her humiliation unfold. Nora stood on the ceremonial stone, the granite biting into the soles of her bare feet. Around her, the Silver Creek pack formed a silent, suffocating circle, their combined scent a heavy mix of pine, damp earth, and judgment. This was supposed to be a sacred night, the night of the mating vow, but for her, it was a sentencing. The wind whispered through the ancient oaks, carrying not blessings, but the stench of her own fear. She was an Omega, a disgrace, and this bond was not a gift, but a chain. The Alpha's son waited for her, his eyes promising a lifetime of the same contempt she saw mirrored in the faces of the pack. Something primal and broken inside her clawed at her throat, a scream without a voice. This was the end of one life, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she could not let it be the beginning of another. Marcus stood before her, the moonlight glinting, off the cruel curve of his smile. He was the future Alpha, golden and powerful, everything the pack revered. And he despised her. The moon had decreed their bond, a cosmic joke that had sealed her fate the moment she'd presented as an Omega with a weak, hesitant wolf. He'd made his displeasure known in 100 small cruelties, a dismissive sneer, a shoulder shoved past her in the common hall, the way he'd let his chosen betas corner her and whisper threats about how an Omega would learn her place once she was officially bound. The worst had been 2 nights ago. Hidden in the shadows outside the training grounds, she'd heard him laughing with his friends. The moon must have been drunk, he'd boasted, his voice dripping with venom, pairing me with that wolfless scrap. Don't worry. Once the bond is sealed, I'll have her on a tight leash. An Omega's only purpose is to submit. I'll enjoy teaching her that lesson. The memory was a shard of ice in her heart. She looked at him now, at the triumphant smirk playing on his lips, and knew he was thinking of it. He saw not a mate, but a conquest, a thing to be broken. Elder Maeve, her face a mask of stern tradition, raised a ceremonial bowl filled with moon-blessed water. Marcus of Silver Creek, she intoned, her voice echoing in the tense silence. Do you accept this bond, forged by the will of the goddess, and swear to protect and command your mate, Nora Halden, for all your days? I accept, Marcus said, his voice a low, possessive growl. He didn't look at her. He looked past her, at his father, the reigning Alpha, who nodded in grim approval. He was accepting a duty, claiming a piece of property. Nora's breath hitched. Her hands, hidden in the folds of her simple white ceremonial gown, trembled uncontrollably. The fabric was coarse, a deliberate choice to remind her of her station. Everything was a reminder. Elder Maeve turned to her, her dark eyes holding no warmth, only impatience. Nora of Silver Creek, do you accept this bond, and swear to honor and obey your mate, Marcus, for all your days? The words caught in her throat. Honor, obey, they tasted like ash. Her wolf, a timid whisper in the back of her mind, whimpered and shrank away. It had been that way since her first shift, a hesitant, fearful thing that had earned her the scorn of the pack. They called her wolfless, a broken Omega. She squeezed her eyes shut, the faces of the pack swimming in the darkness behind her lids, accusing, mocking, hungry for her submission. Say it, Marcus mouthed at her, his smile tightening into a snarl. The silence stretched, thin and brittle. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. This was her final humiliation. The pathetic Omega, too afraid to even speak her vows. But it wasn't fear that held her tongue. It was rebellion. A tiny, flickering flame of it that had been kindled by his cruelty and fanned by her desperation. She thought of the secret she carried, the folded, brittle parchment tucked into a hidden pocket sewn inside her gown. A different vow, a desperate gamble. Nora, Elder Maeve prompted, her voice sharp as flint. The moon waits. Nora opened her eyes. She met Marcus's gaze, and for the first time, she did not look away. She did not flinch. She let him see the cold, hard resolve solidifying in her soul. His smirk faltered, confusion flickering in its place. She took a single step back. A collective gasp swept through the circle. Taking a step back from the bonding stone was sacrilege. It was a refusal. What are you doing? Marcus hissed, his voice dangerously low. She took another step. The granite was cold, but the earth behind her felt like freedom. The scent of pine and wild things called to her, a promise of escape. She rejects the bond, someone shouted from the circle. Chaos erupted. The silent judgment turned into a roar of outrage. Marcus's face contorted with fury, his features sharpening as his wolf surged to the surface. "You dare?" he snarled, lunging for her. He was fast, but her desperation was faster. Nora spun around, the coarse gown tangling around her legs. She ripped at the fabric, tearing it away from her knees as she scrambled from the ceremonial platform and plunged into the darkness of the surrounding forest. His enraged howl ripped through the night air, a sound that promised pain and retribution. It was followed by the deeper, more authoritative command of his father. "Bring her back." The hunt was on. Branches whipped at her face, thorns tore at her skin and the thin fabric of her dress. Her lungs burned, each breath a ragged gasp. Behind her, she could hear them, the heavy, rhythmic pounding of paws as the pack warriors shifted, their growls echoing through the trees. They would be faster, stronger. They would run her down like prey. Panic was a physical thing, a cold claw squeezing her heart. She pushed it down, focusing on the path she had memorized for weeks, a twisting, barely there game trail that led away from the packlands. She ran not with the strength of a wolf, but with the terror of a cornered animal. The forest floor was a treacherous carpet of roots and stones, and she stumbled, her ankle twisting painfully. A cry escaped her lips, but she bit it back, shoving herself up and forcing her protesting body onward. The sounds of pursuit were getting closer. Their predatory scents, hot fur and rage filled the air. Finally, she saw it. A dark, gaping maw in the side of a rocky outcrop, hidden by a curtain of ancient ivy. The entrance to the old smuggler's cave. It was forbidden territory, rumored to be haunted by the ghosts of rogues. It was her only hope. She dove through the ivy, her body scraping against the rock, and collapsed onto the damp, cold floor of the cave. She held her breath, listening. The sounds of the hunt passed the cave entrance. Heavy paws pounded the earth, growls and snarls, fading as they continued their search deeper into the woods. They hadn't caught her scent trail leading inside. The dampness of the cave and the thick ivy had masked it just enough. For now, Nora lay there, her body trembling, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She couldn't stay. They would double back eventually, search more thoroughly. She pushed herself deeper into the darkness, her hands outstretched, feeling her way along the cold, slick wall. The air grew colder, heavy with the smell of wet stone and decay. At the very back of the small cavern, a flicker of light appeared from behind a jutting rock. "You're late," a gravelly voice said. A man stepped out from the shadows, holding a small oil lamp. He was old, his face a roadmap of scars, his eyes holding the weary cynicism of a man who had seen too much. Silas, a fringe dweller, a trader of secrets and forbidden goods, and the one who had answered her desperate, whispered plea for a way out. They were close, Nora whispered, her voice hoarse. Silas grunted, unimpressed. "They're always close. Do you have it?" Nora's numb fingers fumbled with the hidden pocket in her torn dress, pulling out the small, folded parchment. It was a marriage contract, ancient and unforgiving. Silas had procured it for her, a relic from the old laws, from a time when alliances were sealed with faceless vows. A binding agreement to a man from a distant territory, a man whose name she barely registered in her panic, a scrawled signature at the bottom. Dorn. The price for his signature, and her freedom, was her hand in marriage, a stranger for a monster. It was a choice she had made in the dark, and one she would have to live with in the light. "He agreed?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The alpha of the Blackwood territories is a man of his word, and his needs are specific. A bride with no ties, no family to make demands, no pack to avenge her if she displeases him. "You fit the description perfectly," Silas said, his words blunt and devoid of comfort. He took the parchment from her and unrolled it, examining it in the lamplight. "All it needs is your signature. Your vow. Blood, as is custom." He produced a small, silver-bladed knife. Nora stared at it, her fear momentarily overshadowed by the finality of the act. To sign this was to sever everything she had ever known, to renounce her pack, her name, her past, to become the property of another unknown alpha. But it was a choice, her choice. Marcus would have given her no choice at all. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she held out her hand. "Do it." Silas took her thumb, making a small, sharp cut. Blood welled, dark in the flickering light. He pressed her thumb to the parchment, just below the unfamiliar scrawl of the other signature. The blood smeared onto the dry, ancient paper, a crimson seal of her fate. The moment her blood touched the contract, a strange, faint warmth pulsed through it. A flicker of old magic acknowledging the vow. "It is done," Silas said, rolling up the scroll and tucking it into his leather satchel. "You are no longer Nora of Silver Creek. You are his now." He gestured toward a dark fissure at the back of the cave. "This tunnel leads out to the old road on the other side of the ridge. A carriage is waiting. It will take you to your new home. Do not speak to the driver. Do not look back." Nora nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She gave the old rogue the few silver coins she had managed to save, her entire worldly wealth. He pocketed them without a word of thanks. "Go," he said, already extinguishing his lamp, plunging the cave back into darkness. "And may the moon have mercy on you, child, because your new husband may not." The tunnel was narrow and suffocating. Nora crawled and stumbled through the oppressive dark, the old man's words echoing in her mind. When she finally emerged into the night, gasping the cold, clean air, she saw it. A lightless black carriage, drawn by two massive, silent horses that stood as still as statues. The driver was a silhouette, a cloaked figure who didn't turn as she approached. The carriage door swung open on its own. Hesitantly, she climbed inside. The interior was lined with dark velvet, surprisingly plush. The door closed, shutting her in absolute darkness and silence. A moment later, with a lurch, the carriage began to move. There was no sound of hooves, no creak of wheels, just a smooth, unnerving glide through the night. The journey was a blur of exhaustion and fear. Nora huddled in the corner, the adrenaline finally draining away, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness. Her torn dress was cold and damp, her body ached, and her mind was a whirlwind of what she had done. What was to become of her? Who was this man, this Alpha Dorn, who would take a runaway Omega as his bride? She must have slept. Her eyes fluttered open not to the rocking darkness of the carriage, but to the soft gray light of dawn filtering through heavy silk curtains. She was lying in a bed. A vast, impossibly soft bed, piled high with down pillows and furs. The sheets against her skin were silk, cool and smooth. A fire crackled softly in a massive stone fireplace across the room, casting dancing shadows on tapestried walls. The air itself was different. It smelled of power, of old leather, cedar, and the faint, lingering scent of smoke. Confusion warred with a primal sense of alarm. Where was she? This was no simple Alpha's dwelling. This was a place of immense wealth and power. She sat up, the silk sheet pooling around her waist. She was wearing a simple linen nightgown, clean and soft. Someone had changed her. The thought sent a jolt of ice through her veins. Then she felt it, a faint, unfamiliar warmth on her shoulder, a subtle thrum against her skin like a second heartbeat. She pushed the strap of the nightgown aside and looked down. There, just above her, collarbone, was a mark. It was faint, a delicate tracery of silver lines that seemed to shimmer in the low light, but it was undeniably a claim, an Alpha's mark. Not the crude, possessive brand of her old pack, but something more ancient, more elegant, and infinitely more powerful. It hadn't been there in the cave. A slow, terrifying dread began to uncoil in the pit of her stomach. The scent of cedar and smoke was stronger now, closer. It wasn't just in the room. It was beside her. Slowly, forcing her head to move against the screaming instinct to flee, she turned. A man lay sleeping beside her, his back partially turned to her. He was immense, his broad, scarred back a landscape of old battles and brutal strength. Even in sleep, he radiated an aura of absolute, lethal authority. His dark hair was a tousled mess on the pillow. One powerful arm, corded with muscle and etched with more scars, was thrown across the sheets, his hand resting mere inches from her hip. Her heart stopped. This had to be him, her husband, the mysterious Alpha Dorn. As she watched, frozen in terror and awe, he shifted in his sleep, rolling slightly onto his back. The dawn light fell across his face. It was a harsh, striking face, all sharp angles and uncompromising lines, softened only by sleep. A jagged scar cut down from his left temple, narrowly missing his eye, and as the sheet slipped lower, she saw that the faint, glowing claim mark on her own shoulder was a perfect mirror of a symbol tattooed over his heart. Nora's mind reeled, trying to piece together the impossible. The faceless contract, the opulent room, the overwhelming sense of ancient power, the name on the parchment Dorn. It wasn't just the name of an Alpha, it was the name of the royal line. a name whispered in fear and reverence across all the territories. Her gaze fell back to the man beside her, to the harsh, noble profile and the crown of scars. And she knew, with a soul-shattering certainty that stole the Riss's very breath from her lungs, she knew who she was lying beside. This was no mere alpha of the Blackwood territories. This was King Raphael Dorn, the Alpha King, and his mark was glowing on her skin. Panic was a living thing, a cold serpent coiling in her belly. Her every instinct screamed at her to run, to bolt from the bed and the room and this impossible reality. But her limbs were frozen, locked in place by a terror so profound it felt like ice flooding her veins. She lay perfectly still, barely breathing, her eyes fixed on the sleeping king, the Alpha King. The name itself was a legend, a story told to frighten pups, a saga of a warrior who had united the warring packs through sheer, brutal force. He was a myth made of shadow and steel, and he was sleeping in her bed. No, her bed? She was in his bed, a piece of property delivered in the night. The scent of him was overwhelming cedar and wood smoke. Yes, but underneath that was something wilder, something that smelled of ozone, before a storm and the metallic tang of old blood. It was the scent of absolute power, and it made the timid wolf inside her want to flatten itself to the ground and expose its throat. She fought the instinct, a bitter wave of self-loathing rising with it. She had run from one alpha only to be trapped by the ultimate alpha. He stirred. A low sound, less a groan than the rumble of shifting stone, escaped his lips. Nora's heart hammered against her ribs so violently she was sure he must hear it. His eyes opened. They were not the color she expected. Not black or gray like the stones of his fortress, but a startling, molten amber, like the heart of a flame. They were ancient eyes, filled with a weariness that warred with a sharp, predatory intelligence, and they were fixed directly on her. There was no surprise in them, no confusion. He looked at her as if he had been expecting her, as if he had been aware of her presence the entire time. Nora couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. She could only stare back, a rabbit caught in the gaze of a wolf king. He pushed himself up, leaning on one elbow. The silk sheet slid down his chest, revealing a stunning landscape of scars. They crisscrossed his torso, a testament to a life of violence. The white, puckered lines of old claws, the faint, silver sheen of blades, one dark, angry burn that spread across his ribs. He was not a king who sat on a throne. He was a king who had carved his throne from the bones of his enemies. "Nora Halden," he said. His voice was deeper than she could have imagined, a low, gravelly timbre that seemed to vibrate in the very air around them. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, of ownership. She could only manage a single, terrified nod. Her throat was a knot of unshed screams. He watched her for a long moment, his amber eyes taking in her wide, frightened gaze, the tremble in her hands where she clutched the sheet to her chest, the pale glimmer of his mark on her shoulder. His expression was unreadable, a mask of stone. He exuded a stillness that was more terrifying than any overt threat. Marcus had been loud in his cruelty, all snarls and boasts. This man was silent, and in his silence, she felt the weight of annihilation. "The contract is sealed," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "The vow was made in blood. You are bound to me. You are my wife." Wife! The word was an absurdity. She was a runaway, a disgraced Omega who had been sold like livestock. She wasn't a wife. She was a prisoner in a gilded cage. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, his back to her. The sheer scale of him was breathtaking. He was a mountain of muscle and power, every line of his body honed for combat. He rose to his feet, and for the first time, Nora felt truly, hopelessly small. He walked to the fireplace, completely naked, utterly unconcerned by his state of undress or her presence. He was the king. His body was a weapon, and his kingdom was his own. He stoked the fire, sending a shower of orange sparks dancing up the chimney. "You ran from your mate," he stated, his back still to her. "From the alpha of Silver Creek's whelp. How did he know?" The question died before it could form on her lips. He was the king. He knew everything. "A foolish, desperate choice," he continued, his voice resonating with the crackle of the flames, "but one that served a purpose. Fate required a bride with no allegiances, a queen with no ties to the vipers in my own court." He turned then, his amber eyes pinning her to the bed. "You, Nora Halden, were the answer to a prayer I never uttered." His words made no sense. A queen? Her? She was an omega, practically wolfless. She wasn't queen material. She was barely pack material. Was this some kind of cruel joke? A punishment for her defiance? As if hearing her thoughts, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his mouth, a gesture that held no warmth. You are confused. Good. Confusion is a safer state than certainty in this place. Before she could process this, there was a firm, deferential knock on the chamber door. Enter, the king commanded, his voice returning to its flat, authoritative tone. The heavy oak door swung open, and an older woman entered, her back ramrod straight. She was dressed in severe gray wool, her hair pulled back in a tight, unforgiving bun. Her face was grim, her eyes sharp and assessing. She curtsied low, not even flinching at the king's nudity. Her gaze slid over to Nora, still huddled in the massive bed, and a flicker of undisguised contempt crossed her features. Your Majesty, the woman said, her voice crisp and cold. The baths are prepared. Good, Elspeth, the king replied. He retrieved a dark fur robe from a nearby chair and shrugged it on, belting it loosely at his waist. See to my wife. She is to be made presentable. The word wife sounded even more alien from the woman's thin lips than it had from the king's. Elspeth's eyes raked over Nora again, a dismissive, insulting appraisal that made Nora feel like something discovered under a rock. As you command, Your Majesty, she said, her tone implying that the task was deeply unpleasant. The king walked toward the door, pausing beside the bed. He looked down at her, and for a fleeting second, the mask slipped. Nora saw something in his eyes, a flash of something dark and complex. It wasn't cruelty, it was resonance, a shared shadow. Do as she says, he ordered, his voice soft but absolute. In this castle, obedience is survival. Then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a heavy final thud that echoed in the sudden silence. Nora was alone with the servant. The woman, Elspeth, stared at her, her lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line. Get out of the king's bed, girl, she snapped, her deferential tone vanishing the moment the king was gone. You defile it with your presence. Shame, hot and familiar, washed over Nora. This was a language she understood, the contempt of those with status for those without. She slid from the bed, the silk of the sheets a final, fleeting caress. The floorboards were cold beneath her bare feet. The linen nightgown felt flimsy and inadequate under the woman's piercing stare. The king may have been forced into this arrangement, Elspeth said, her voice dripping with scorn, but do not for a moment mistake your position. You are a placeholder, a necessary disgrace. You are not, nor will you ever be, a queen. Elspeth seized her arm, her grip surprisingly strong, and pulled her toward an adjoining chamber. It was a bathing room, larger than the entire cottage she had grown up in. A massive copper tub steamed in the center, filled with fragrant, herb-scented water. Servants, young girls with downcast eyes, scurried out of the room as Elspeth entered, clearly terrified of her. Strip, Elspeth commanded. Nora hesitated for a fraction of a second, and the woman's fingers dug into her arm like talons. Now. Clumsily, her hands trembling, Nora pulled the nightgown over her head. She stood naked and exposed, her skin prickling with humiliation. She had a dozen faded bruises from her flight through the forest, a long scratch on her thigh. She felt frail and used. Elspeth's eyes catalogued every flaw before she gestured impatiently at the tub. Nora sank into the hot water, the heat a blessed shock that soothed her aching muscles. But there was no comfort to be found. Elspeth began to wash her, her movements rough and impersonal, as if she were scrubbing a floor. She scrubbed at Nora's skin, at her hair, her silence more damning than any insult. She paid particular attention to the king's mark on her shoulder, her touch lingering there with a cold, resentful pressure, as if she could scour it away. When it was over, Elspeth wrapped her in a thick, heavy towel and led her back to the main chamber. Laid out on the bed was a dress. It was simple, made of a heavy, dark blue wool, but the fabric was of a quality Nora had never touched before. There were soft leather slippers and clean underthings. Dress, Elspeth ordered, turning her back to give the barest illusion of privacy. Nora dressed quickly, the soft wool, a small comfort against her clean skin. The dress fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her, a fact she found deeply unsettling. When she was finished, Elspeth turned back, her critical eye finding some invisible fault. She walked over to Nora and roughly tucked a stray piece of hair behind her ear. You have the scent of the wild on you, the woman muttered, a deep-seated insult among the courtly shifters. The king has indulged some strange whim, but the court will not be so forgiving. They will smell what you are, an omega, a runaway. They will smell your fear, and they will devour you. The woman's words were meant to terrify her, and they did. The thought of facing a royal court, a pack of alphas and high-born wolves who would see her as less than nothing, was suffocating. "The king has requested your presence in the northern solar," Elspeth said, her formal tone returning as she steered Nora toward the door. "Do not speak unless you are spoken to. Do not look the king in the eye unless he commands it. Do not, under any circumstances, show your weakness." The hallway outside the chamber was a long, cavernous passage of gray stone, hung with ancient banners depicting a snarling, crowned wolf, the sigil of House Dorn. The silence of the castle was immense, broken only by the soft whisper of their footsteps. There were no servants in the halls, no guards in sight, yet Nora felt 100 unseen eyes watching her every move. This place was alive, and it was hostile. Elspeth led her to a pair of towering iron-bound doors and, without knocking, pushed them open. The room was a library or a study. Bookshelves stretched to the vaulted ceiling, filled with thousands of leather-bound volumes. A fire roared in a fireplace even larger than the one in the bedroom, and in the center of the room, standing before a massive window that overlooked a sheer drop to a churning sea, was the king. He was dressed now, in simple black trousers and a dark tunic that did nothing to hide the power of his form. He didn't turn as they entered. "Leave us," he commanded, his voice quiet. Elspeth bowed low and retreated, pulling the heavy doors shut behind her, the sound echoing like a tomb ceiling. The sound of the waves crashing against the rocks below filled the sudden silence. Nora stood frozen just inside the door, her hands clenched at her sides. He still hadn't looked at her. "Come here," he said, his gaze still fixed on the gray, tumultuous sea. Her feet felt like lead. Taking a deep breath, she forced herself to walk across the vast expanse of the room, the thick carpets muffling her steps. She stopped a few feet behind him, her eyes on the rigid line of his back. "I made a bargain not with you, but with fate," he said, his voice a low murmur, almost lost in the sound of the waves. "There is a sickness in my bloodline, a curse. The moon weakens with each generation of my family. My wolf is not whole. It requires a tether, an anchor to this world." He finally turned, and his amber eyes were blazing with an intensity that seared her. The seers spoke of a mate of pure heart, forged in betrayal and tempered by defiance, a wolf hidden within a lamb. They said her blood would be the key. He took a step closer, and the sheer force of his presence was a physical blow. She could feel the wild, barely contained power rolling off him in waves. This was the curse he spoke of, an unimaginable power, so great it was tearing him apart. "I did not believe them," he rasped, his voice raw with a pain that seemed centuries old, "until my spies brought me whispers of an Omega in Silver Creek, an Omega who defied her Alpha on her bonding night, an Omega who chose the unknown over the chain." He reached out, his hand stopping just short of her face, his fingers trembling with a power that made the very air crackle. "And when I saw the contract with your blood on it, I felt the bond snap into place across 1,000 miles. A bond not of my choosing, but of destiny's." His gaze dropped to the mark on her shoulder, visible above the collar of her dress. "That is not my claim, girl. That is the moon's. A mark that says you are the other half of this curse. You are my anchor, my keeper." He let his hand fall, a look of profound, bitter resignation on his face. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and she was no longer just a runaway Omega. In his eyes, she was a prophecy, a tool, a sacrifice. "The court gathers at sundown," he said, his tone turning to ice. "They will come to see the king's new pet. They will see an Omega whelp and smell weakness. They will test you. They will try to break you." He moved to a table, pouring a dark liquid into a goblet. "And you will let them see nothing. You will stand beside me. You will wear the jewels they give you, and you will hold your head high. You will be silent. You will be graceful, and you will give them nothing." He drank deep from the goblet, his throat working. "Your life, and possibly mine, depends on it." The finality in his voice was a death knell. She wasn't his wife. She wasn't his queen. She was a shield, a piece in a deadly game she didn't understand, against players she couldn't see, with a king whose curse was now her own. Her escape had led her not to freedom, but to the very heart of the storm. The hours between the king's pronouncement and sundown were a blur of meticulous, cold preparation. Elspeth returned, not alone this time, but with 2 young, silent maids in her wake. They moved with the quiet efficiency of ghosts, their eyes always downcast, their hands never still. They carried with them a dress that seemed woven from the midnight sky, a deep, starless velvet that drank the light from the room. It was beautiful, a work of art, and it felt utterly alien against Nora's skin. As they laced her into the gown, the boning tight and unforgiving, she felt like a doll being arranged for display. It was a costume, a lie she was being forced to wear. Next came the jewels. Elspeth opened a heavy, iron-bound box to reveal a nest of black velvet upon which lay a king's ransom in diamonds and sapphires. They were magnificent, catching the firelight and splintering it into 1,000 cold, sharp pieces. "The Dorn sapphires," Elspeth said, her voice devoid of the reverence the jewels deserved. She lifted a heavy necklace, its central stone the size of a robin's egg, dark and fathomless. Worn by queens for 500 years, the metal was shockingly cold against Nora's throat. It felt less like an adornment and more like a beautifully wrought collar. Bracelets were clasped onto her wrists, heavy and ornate, feeling like shackles. The maids worked on her hair, twisting and pinning the simple brown strands into an elaborate style that felt too severe, too regal for the girl from Silver Creek. With every pin, every tug, Nora felt herself disappearing, being erased and replaced by this silent, decorated effigy. "A crow dressed in a swan's feathers is still a crow," Elspeth murmured, more to herself than to Nora, as she gave a final, critical inspection. "Try to remember that, and try not to shame him more than you already have." The words were meant to wound, and they did. Shame was an old, familiar cloak, and it settled over her shoulders more comfortably than the velvet did. She was a fraud, a wolfless omega parading as a queen. The king had called her a key, an anchor, but standing there, weighed down by gems and lies, she felt like a sacrifice being dressed for the altar. When the preparations were finally complete, 2 guards, their faces impassive beneath plumed helms, appeared at the door. They did not speak, only stood at attention, waiting. Elspeth gave Nora a slight, forceful push between the shoulder blades. "It is time. Walk as if you belong here, even if it is a lie." The walk to the great hall was the longest of her life. The corridors of the castle were vast and intimidating, the stone walls seeming to absorb all sound, leaving only the soft whisper of her velvet gown and the heavy, rhythmic tread of the guards' boots. Torches flickered in iron sconces, casting long, dancing shadows that twisted and writhed like tormented spirits. Tapestries depicting great hunts and brutal battles lined the walls, the woven wolf's eyes seeming to follow her with silent accusation. With every step, Nora's fear grew. She tried to reach for her wolf, for that small, timid part of herself, but it was cowering so. Deep within her it was little more than a faint, terrified pulse. Instead, another feeling brushed against her consciousness, a low, resonant hum, like a distant thunderstorm. It was the king's power. Since waking with the moon's mark on her skin, she could feel him, a constant, powerful presence at the edge of her senses. It was not a comforting feeling. It was the feeling of being tethered to a living storm, knowing it could break at any moment and obliterate her. They reached a pair of colossal doors, 20 feet high, carved with the snarling wolf of House Dorn. The guards took their positions on either side, and one lifted a heavy iron rod, striking a great bronze gong that hung beside the entrance. The sound was deep and resonant, a boom that vibrated through the stone floor and up into Nora's bones. It was an announcement, an arrival. Her arrival. The great doors swung inward, revealing the scene she had been dreading. The great hall was a cavern of torchlight and sound. It was packed, a sea of silks and velvets, of glittering jewels and watchful eyes. Hundreds of shifters, the high-born alphas and betas of the realm, filled the vast space. The air was thick with the scent of expensive wine, roasted meat, cloying perfumes, and the sharp, animal musk of power and ambition. The moment the doors opened, a wave of noise washed over her music from a gallery, laughter, the hum of 100 conversations, and then silence. It fell like a blade, swift and absolute. Every head turned, every pair of eyes cold, curious, hostile, fixed on her. The silence was broken a second later by a sound far worse, the rustle of whispers, spreading through the crowd like a contagion. Nora stood frozen in the doorway, the light from the hall pinning her like an insect. She could feel their gazes on her, dissecting her, judging her. She could practically hear their thoughts. "That's her? The Omega? She's so plain. "The king has lost his senses." Her blood ran cold. Elspeth was right. They could smell what she was. They could smell her fear. From the far end of the hall, upon a raised dais, a figure rose from a massive, throne-like chair carved from dark, polished wood. The king. He stood alone, a solitary pillar of power in the suddenly quiet hall. He was dressed in black leather and dark, royal wool, a simple circlet of scarred, dark iron, the only crown he wore. He did not smile. He simply watched her, his amber eyes burning with an unreadable fire across the expanse of the room. Her instructions were clear. "Stand beside me." She had to walk the length of this hall, through this gauntlet of predators, and take her place at his side. Her feet wouldn't move. Her legs trembled, threatening to give way beneath her. The whispers grew louder, more confident. A woman with jewels flashing in her fiery red hair laughed, a short, sharp bark of contempt, and didn't bother to hide it behind her hand. Just as the first tear of panic pricked at the back of her eye, the king's voice cut through the hall. "My lords, my ladies." His voice was not loud, but it carried the weight of absolute command, silencing every lesser sound. "You will show respect to your queen." Queen. The word hung in the air, a challenge and a decree. It sent another shockwave through the court. This wasn't just a consort, a temporary bride. He had named her queen. His gaze held hers, a silent, unyielding order. "Walk." Somehow, she found the strength. She lifted her chin, just as he'd commanded, and forced one foot in front of the other. The walk was an agony. She kept her eyes fixed on him, a distant, dangerous shore in a sea of sharks. The whispers followed her, a constant, hissing wake. She felt their scorn like a physical touch, cold and sharp against her skin. When she finally reached the dais, her legs were shaking so badly she was terrified she would collapse. She ascended the few steps and came to a stop beside his throne, careful not to look at him, her gaze fixed somewhere on the ancient stones of the far wall. The silence in the hall was now thick with tension, a palpable, breathing thing. She could feel the weight of their collective disbelief, their outrage. She stood rigidly, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, her knuckles white. She was going to break. She could feel the composure, so carefully constructed by Elspeth's maids, cracking like thin ice. The trembling in her hands was spreading to her arms, her whole body. Any moment now, they would all see. They would see the terrified little Omega, and they would laugh. Then, she felt it. A sudden, searing heat on the small of her back. The king had moved, his motion so swift and silent she hadn't seen it. He had placed his hand on her, his fingers splayed against the velvet of her gown. His touch was a brand, a shock that jolted through her entire body. It was possessive, a clear and public claim. Through the fabric, his skin was impossibly hot, and a current of raw power flowed from him into her, a steadying, terrifying force. It didn't stop the trembling, but it contained it, anchoring her in place. He leaned in, his lips brushing against her ear, his breath a warm gust of cedar and smoke against her cold skin. His voice was a low, guttural whisper, meant only for her. "Breathe," he commanded. "Their whispers are wind. I am the storm. Stand in my shadow and you will not be broken." His words, his touch, his scent, it was an overwhelming sensory assault. He was not comforting her. He was commanding her. He was shielding his asset, not protecting a wife. Yet, for the first time since she'd fled Silver Creek, she did not feel utterly, hopelessly alone. She was a shield, yes, but he was a fortress at her back. She took a shaky breath, then another, drawing strength from the solid, burning pressure of his hand. The gesture did not go unnoticed. A new wave of murmurs swept the hall, this time tinged with confusion and a grudging respect for the king's audacity. He was not hiding his choice, he was forcing them to accept it. His hand remained on her back, a constant grounding weight. He turned his attention back to the court, his face an unreadable mask of sovereign authority. "Tonight, we celebrate the will of the moon," he announced, his voice ringing with iron. "She has blessed this union and secured the future of the kingdom." A tense, uncertain cheer went through the crowd. Goblets were raised. The music started up again, hesitant at first, then swelling to fill the hall. The spell of silence was broken. People began to move, to talk, but their eyes kept flicking back to the dais, to the strange Omega girl who stood claimed and protected at their terrifying king's side. For a while, it seemed his display of power had been enough. Lords and ladies approached the dais to offer strained, formal congratulations. their eyes holding a mixture of fear and cunning. Nora remained silent, a statue of a queen, nodding when they spoke to her, feeling the constant hot pressure of Raphael's hand guiding her, warning her, holding her together. But the peace was a fragile thing. As a servant offered them wine, a woman detached herself from a circle of richly dressed nobles and approached the dais with predatory grace. It was the redhead who had laughed at her. She was beautiful, with sharp, intelligent eyes and a smile that was all teeth. Her velvet gown was the color of blood, and a magnificent ruby glittered at her throat. She curtsied, a low, sinuous movement that was both respectful and mocking. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice smooth as honey but laced with venom. She addressed the king, but her cold eyes were fixed on Nora. "And, Your Grace, Duchess Isolde," the king acknowledged, his voice flat. His hand on Nora's back tightened almost imperceptibly. "Forgive my impertinence, Your Majesty," the Duchess purred, her smile widening. "The kingdom rejoices in your happiness, of course. We have all prayed for the curse to be managed." She let the word hang in the air, a delicate, poisoned dart. "But the pack's whisper of the moon's weakness. And you present us with this." She made a small dismissive gesture toward Nora. "An omega, unclaimed by her own pack, I hear. A runaway." Isolde's voice rose just enough to carry to the surrounding nobles, who fell silent to listen. She took a deliberate step closer, her eyes narrowing as she looked directly at Nora. "How can such a creature anchor a king?" she asked, her voice now ringing with challenge in the suddenly quiet hall, "when she cannot even anchor her own wolf." The Duchess's words struck the air like a whip crack. A collective, indrawn breath seemed to suck the very warmth from the hall. How can such a creature anchor a king, when she cannot even anchor her own wolf? The accusation was not just an insult. It was a direct challenge to the king's judgment, to the moon's decree, and to Nora's very right to exist in this place. It was a declaration of war, delivered with a honeyed smile. Nora felt the blood drain from her face. The heat of the king's hand on her back was suddenly the only thing holding her upright. The faces in the crowd turned on her, no longer just curious, but hungry, like a pack of wolves scenting a fatal weakness in the herd. Isolde's sharp, cruel eyes gleamed with triumph. She had exposed the lie. She had named the flaw for all to see, the wolfless omega, the empty vessel. King Raphael did not move. Nora could feel the stillness in him, a terrifying, coiled tension like a predator about to strike. The power rolling off him intensified, the air around the dais growing heavy and charged. She risked a glance at his face. His expression was utterly devoid of emotion, his amber eyes fixed on Duchess Isolde with a flat, lethal focus. The temperature in the hall seemed to drop, several degrees. "Duchess," he said, his voice a low, soft rumble that was more menacing than any shout. "You tread on dangerous ground." Isolde's smile didn't waver, but a flicker of something caution, perhaps even fear, entered her eyes. She was brave, or foolish, to have challenged him so openly. "I speak only from concern for the kingdom, Your Majesty. Your line is everything. A weak queen means a weak heir. A weak heir means chaos. Surely, the court has a right to know the quality of the vessel you have chosen." The word vessel was another calculated cut, reducing Nora to a mere broodmare, and a defective one at that. Humiliation, hot and sickening, churned in Nora's stomach. She wanted to shrink, to disappear, to flee back, to the anonymity of her room, back to the forest, back to any place but here, under the weight of 1,000 hostile eyes. But the king's hand was still on her back, a burning, inflexible wall. His whisper had echoed in her. "Mind, stand in my shadow, and you will not be broken." This was the test he had warned her about. This was the moment she either shattered or held. He did not defend her. He did not deny the accusation. Instead, he did something far more unexpected. He removed his hand from her back. For a terrifying second, she felt adrift, exposed. But then, he took her hand. His fingers closed around hers, engulfing her smaller hand in his. His skin was calloused and warm, his grip firm, possessive, and shockingly intimate in front of the entire court. He drew her forward slightly, so she stood not just beside him, but a half step in front of him, under the full, unforgiving light of the hall's chandeliers. He was not hiding her. He was presenting her. "The quality of my queen," he said, his voice resonating with a power that made the wine tremble in nearby goblets, "is not a matter for debate. It is a matter of fact, decreed by a power far older than any in this room. He squeezed her hand, a silent command. Now. Nora's mind went blank with panic. What did he want? What could she possibly do or say? Her throat was closed, her tongue a useless stone in her mouth. She stared out at the sea of predatory faces, at Duchess Isolda's triumphant sneer, and felt the familiar, crushing weight of her own inadequacy. Her wolf whimpered, a distant, pathetic sound in the abyss of her soul. And then, something shifted. It wasn't her own strength that rose to meet the challenge. It was his. Through the point of contact where their hands were clasped, she felt a jolt, a surge of his immense, wild power. It wasn't a gentle sharing. It was an invasion. A torrent of raw, untamed energy flooded her, fierce and hot, and tasting of ozone and blood. It bypassed her fear, her shame, her weak and timid nature, and struck something deep within her. It was calling to the part of her she thought was dead. It was calling to her wolf. For the first time in years, her wolf responded. It did, not cower. Stirred by the sheer, overwhelming force of his alpha command, it lifted its head. It was still small, still frightened, but for the first time, it didn't shrink away. It answered the call. A faint, almost imperceptible shimmer bloomed in her eyes, a pale silver glow that mirrored the light of the absent moon. It was a flicker, nothing more, but in the heightened senses of the shifters gathered, it was as noticeable as a flare. A gasp went through the crowd. Duchess Isolde's smile froze on her face, her eyes widening in disbelief. Nora felt the change within herself. It was a spark of warmth in the frozen landscape of her spirit. It was not power, not strength, but presence. The simple, undeniable truth that her wolf was there. Hidden, yes. Silent, yes, but not gone. The king's grip on her hand was iron, anchoring her to the moment, feeding that tiny, nascent spark with his own indomitable will. He had known. Somehow, he had known he could do this, that he could reach past her fear and touch the core of her. Nora found her voice. It was quiet, unsteady, but it carried in the breathless silence of the hall. My wolf, she said, her gaze meeting Isolde's, does not need to be loud to be present. She surprised herself with the words, with the cold, steady calm that had settled over her. It was his calm, his strength, flowing through her, wearing her voice like a mask. Some creatures, Duchess, find their greatest strength not in the roar, but in the silence. The silence that followed was profound. Isolde stared at her, her mask of confident cruelty shattering into confusion and fury. Nora had not only answered, she had challenged her back. She had turned the insult of her quiet nature into a virtue. The nobles looked from Nora to the king, their expressions shifting from scorn to a wary, uncertain respect. They did not understand what they had just witnessed, but they understood power, and they had just seen a display of it, a quiet, subtle assertion that was, in its own way, as potent as the king's overt command. King Raphael released her hand. The connection broke, and the wave of his power receded, leaving her feeling suddenly cold and shaky, but the tiny ember of her own wolf's presence remained. The Duchess, I am sure, meant no offense. The king said, his voice deceptively smooth. She is merely zealous in her loyalty. He looked at Isolde, and the warmth of his feigned magnanimity vanished, replaced by a gaze as cold and sharp as a shard of ice. A zeal that would be better directed at the enemies outside our walls, rather than the family within them. Would you not agree, Isolde? It was a dismissal, a public, humiliating rebuke wrapped in the language of the court. Isolde's face paled, then flushed a blotchy, furious red. She had overplayed her hand and lost. Of course, Your Majesty, she bit out, the words tasting like poison. She executed another curtsy, this one stiff with rage, and retreated back into the crowd, her blood-red dress a slash of color disappearing among the darker velvets. The tension in the hall broke. The music swelled, louder this time, and conversation resumed, charged with a new, feverish energy. They had a new topic of conversation. The king's Omega bride was not the meek, broken thing they had anticipated. Raphael turned to her. In the relative privacy of the dais, his mask of command relaxed fractionally. He looked down at her, his amber eyes searching her face. He saw her pallor, the faint tremor that had returned to her hands now that his strength was no longer flooding her. You did well, he said, the words low and grudging, as if praise were a foreign language to him. You forced me, she whispered, her voice still shaky. The accusation was soft, but it was there. He had used her used his power to compel a response she could not have given on her own. A shadow passed through his eyes. "I forced you to survive," he corrected her, his voice harsh. "That is the only lesson that matters in this court. Learn it quickly." He gestured to a servant, who brought 2 chairs to the dais, smaller than the great throne but still ornate. "Sit, eat, appear normal. They are still watching." They sat, and plates of food were brought to them: roasted fowl, spiced meats, sweet fruits, and breads. Nora's stomach was a tight knot of nerves. She couldn't imagine eating a bite. But she obeyed his command, picking up a silver fork and pushing a piece of pear around her plate. She could feel the eyes of the court on her still, their whispers a constant, buzzing irritation at the edge of her hearing. They ate in silence for a time. A king and his bargain bride, surrounded by a court that would see them both dead if it could. The sheer isolation of their position was staggering. He was a king with a cursed bloodline, and she was his unwilling, wolfless anchor. "Who is she?" Nora finally asked, her voice barely audible over the music. She didn't need to specify. Raphael didn't look at her. He sliced a piece of meat with brutal precision. "Duchess Isolde de Valois. Her family is old, powerful, and ambitious. Before the contract was signed, she believed she would be my queen." Suddenly, the Duchess's venomous hatred made perfect, terrifying sense. It wasn't just about Nora being an Omega. It was about her taking Isolde's place. A place the Duchess clearly felt was hers, by right of blood and power. "She will not stop," Nora stated, a cold certainty settling in her bones. "She will try again." "Yes," the king agreed, his voice flat. "She will. And so will others. My cousin, Lord Valerius. The Baron of the Ironwood Reach. They all see a throne weakened by a curse and an unsuitable mate. They see an opportunity. They will test you relentlessly, searching for a crack in your resolve. Because if they can break you, they believe they can break me." He finally turned to look at her, his gaze intense, pinning her to her chair. "They must not find one. You must be a fortress, a wall of ice and silence. Do you understand?" Nora nodded, swallowing against the dryness in her throat. She understood all too well. She was not a person to him. She was a piece of his fortification, a living part of his defenses. Her safety, her survival, was incidental to his own. As the evening wore on, a procession of nobles came to pay their respects, their manner now carefully neutral. The king handled them with curt, dismissive authority, his presence a fearsome shield around her. But Nora could feel their probing glances, could sense the questions behind their courteous smiles. She followed his orders, remaining silent, her expression a careful blank, her hands clasped in her lap. She felt like a ghost at her own wedding feast. Later, the king was pulled away by a grim-faced general, their heads bent together in a low, urgent conversation about some border dispute. For the first time all evening, Nora was left truly alone on the dais. The moment the king's formidable presence was no longer directly beside her, the atmosphere shifted. The cautious respect evaporated, and the predatory curiosity returned. A young lord, emboldened by wine, swaggered toward the dais. He was handsome in a cruel sort of way, with a confident smirk that reminded her painfully of Marcus. "Your Grace," he said, his bow too deep, too theatrical. "The court is enchanted by you. Such quiet grace." He leaned against the dais, his proximity an invasion of her space, his scent of wine and arrogance cloying. "The king is a fortunate man. Though, I must confess, some of us wonder what an Omega knows of pleasing a man like him. Perhaps you require lessons in the ways of a true courtier?" His insinuation was vile, his eyes roaming over her body with a possessive, insulting gaze. Her skin crawled. This was exactly the kind of test the king had warned her about. Before she could think of a response, a shadow fell over them. "Lord Emmerich," a deep voice drawled. "I would have thought even you knew better than to bother a caged bird. They have a tendency to sing to their keepers." Nora looked up to see a man standing beside Lord Emmerich. He was tall and lean, with dark, intelligent eyes and a cynical twist to his lips. He wore the black and silver of the king's royal guard, but his bearing was more that of a nobleman than a common soldier. Lord Emmerich paled, his drunken bravado vanishing. "Captain Kalin, I was merely welcoming her grace." "Your welcome is at an end," Captain Kalin said, his voice soft but edged with steel. He didn't raise his voice, didn't make a threat, but the sheer menace in his quiet tone was enough. Emmerich muttered a hasty apology and practically fled. The captain turned his dark eyes on Nora. They were sharp and perceptive, missing nothing. He bowed, a crisp, professional gesture. "Captain Kalen, Your Grace, Commander of the King's Guard. Forgive the intrusion. The king asked me to ensure you were not disturbed." "Thank you, Captain," Nora said, her voice small. He studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "The king does not make mistakes, Your Grace," he said, his voice low. "He may make brutal, difficult, and even cruel choices, but he does not make mistakes. Remember that." It was a strange, cryptic piece of advice. Before she could ask what he meant, the king returned, his face set in a grim, hard line. He saw the captain, and a flicker of understanding passed between the two men. "Is there a problem, Kalen?" the king asked. "None that couldn't be handled, Your Majesty," the captain replied, bowing again before melting back into the shadows of the hall. The king looked down at Nora. His eyes narrowed. "What did Emmerich say to you?" Nora hesitated, the shame of the young lord's words making her want to hide them. But she remembered his command. They must not find a crack. Hiding this would be a weakness. "He questioned my ability to please you," she said, forcing the words out, her cheeks flushing with heat. "He offered to give me lessons." The king's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. A low, guttural growl rumbled in his chest, a sound so primal and dangerous it sent a shiver of fear down her spine. The air around him crackled with barely suppressed violence. For a moment, she thought he was going to hunt the young lord down and tear him apart in front of the entire court, but he didn't. With a visible effort, he reined in the fury, his wolf submitting to the iron will of the king. He took a deep breath, the sound harsh in the relative quiet. He reached out and, for the second time that night, he took her hand. He didn't just hold it. He lifted it to his lips, turning it over and pressing a slow, deliberate kiss to the pulse point on her inner wrist. The touch of his lips on her skin was electric, a searing heat that shot up her arm and straight to her core. It was not a gentle gesture. It was a brand, a possessive, public declaration of ownership that was more intimate and shocking than any open display of affection. He raised his head, his amber eyes burning into hers. "Let them wonder," he whispered, his voice a raw, possessive growl that was meant only for her. "I am the only one who needs to know the truth of what you are." The king did not release her hand. Not when the feast finally drew to its strained and formal close. Not as the last of the wary nobles bowed and retreated from the great hall, leaving them in a cavern of echoing silence and guttering torches. He kept her tethered to him, his grip an unyielding manacle of warm flesh and callous strength as he led her from the dais. The walk back to their chambers was a silent ordeal. The guards fell into step behind them, their armored footfalls a grim metronome counting out the seconds. Of Nora's dread. She was acutely aware of the man beside her, of the rigid, violent tension in his body. His rage over Lord Emmerich's insult had not dissipated. It had been contained, compressed into something dense and dangerous that radiated from him like heat from a furnace. The kiss, if such a brutal, possessive act could be called a kiss, still burned on her wrist, a phantom touch that sent shivers through her. He said nothing, and she dared not speak. What could she say? "Thank you for terrifying me. Thank you for using me as a pawn in your power games." The air between them was thick with unspoken things, with the weight of the evening's trials and the terrifying uncertainty of what was to come. When they reached the heavy doors to their chambers, he dismissed the guards with a curt, sharp gesture. He pushed the doors open himself and pulled her inside, letting them swing shut with a deep, final boom that sealed them in together. The fire in the hearth had been stoked, casting the room in a warm, flickering glow. The massive bed, with its furs and silks, had been turned down, and silent, waiting invitation. Nora's heart began to hammer against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. The public performance was over. Now, they were alone. An Alpha King and the Omega he had bought. The contract had been for marriage, and marriage had duties. The thought sent a wave of nausea and cold terror through her. He finally released her hand. The sudden absence of his touch left her feeling strangely untethered and cold. She instinctively wrapped her arms around herself, a futile gesture of self-protection. He walked to the fireplace, bracing his hands on the stone mantelpiece, his back to her. The firelight played over the powerful muscles of his back and shoulders, outlining his formidable silhouette. He stared down into the flames, his head bowed, as if the weight of his crown or his curse was too heavy to bear. "The night is not over," he said, his voice a low, rough rasp. "The true test begins now." Nora didn't understand. She thought the feast, the challenge from the Duchess, had been the test. "What do you mean?" she whispered, her voice barely carrying across the room. He didn't turn. "Controlling my affliction in public takes a toll. The effort of holding the beast at bay in a room full of challengers. It exacts a price." He took a deep, shuddering breath that seemed to rack his entire frame. "The curse demands its due." A prickle of a new kind of fear, colder and more primal than before, traced its way down her spine. The scent in the room was changing. The familiar smell of cedar and smoke was being overpowered by something else, something sharp and electric. The scent of ozone, the smell of a storm about to break. "What is this curse?" she asked, taking an involuntary step back toward the door. "It is a rage," he growled, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the mantle. "A fire in the blood. The power of the first Alpha King, undiluted, passed down through 100 generations. It is too much for a mortal body to contain. It erodes the separation between man and wolf. Without an anchor, it consumes its host, leaving nothing but a feral, mindless beast." He finally turned to face her, and her breath caught in her throat. The change in him was terrifying. A sheen of sweat slicked his brow. His jaw was clenched so tight a muscle jumped violently in his cheek, but it was his eyes that stole her voice. The calm, molten amber was gone, replaced by a churning, incandescent gold, shot through with sparks of red. They were the eyes of a predator losing its grip, the eyes of the beast clawing its way to the surface. "It is happening now," he snarled, and the sound was less human, more animal. "It is always worse after a confrontation, after a challenge to my authority. It feeds on rage." Nora backed away until her shoulders hit the cold, hard wood of the door. There was nowhere left to run. He hadn't moved from the fireplace, but the sheer, untamed power radiating from him filled the room, pressing in on her, suffocating her. This was the storm he had spoken of, and she was trapped in its eye. He let out a choked cry of pain, stumbling back a step and clutching his head in his hands. His whole body was trembling, not with weakness, but with a terrible, restrained power. The seers spoke of an anchor, he gasped, his voice strained and raw. A mate to ground the storm, to absorb the excess. He looked at her then, his gaze a raw, desperate thing. It held agony, fury, and a terrifying, hungry need. He was a drowning man looking at his only piece of driftwood. Nora stood frozen, her mind screaming. This was what he wanted her for. Not a queen, not a wife. A lightning rod. A thing to absorb the deadly energy that was tearing him apart. Was that her fate? To be consumed by his curse so that he might survive? He took a staggering step toward her, then another. His movements were jerky, uncoordinated, as if he were fighting his own body for control. "Stay back," he ordered, the command a guttural growl that was contradicted by his own movement toward her. I can't stop it," he gritted out, his teeth clenched. A low, continuous growl was building in his chest, a sound of pure, feral rage. The beast wants to claim what is his. It wants to mark you, to break you, to make you mine. His words, his raw, agonized confession of the violence welling inside him, struck her with the force of a physical blow. This was her nightmare realized. She had run from Marcus, who had promised to break her, only to be trapped with a king whose curse promised the same, but with a power 1,000 times more destructive. He was 10 feet away now. 5. The air crackled around him. The tiny silver glint in her own eyes flickered to life again, not from his power this time, but from her own terror, her own wolf finally, responding to the overwhelming, imminent threat. It was a mayfly staring down a hurricane. He lunged, not at her. He veered at the last second, slamming his fist into the stone wall beside the door, just inches from her head. The sound was like a thunderclap. Stone cracked and splintered under the force of the blow. He cried out, a sound of fury and torment, and leaned his forehead against the wall, his whole body shaking with the violence of his inner war. Nora was paralyzed, her cheeks spattered with dust from the shattered stone. She could feel the heat rolling off his body, smell the sweat and the ozone and the raw, untamed power. He was fighting it. For her, he was tearing himself apart to keep the beast from reaching her. The realization was a dizzying shock. He wasn't trying to hurt her. He was trying to protect her from himself. His breathing was ragged, torn from his lungs. "Run," he gasped, his voice broken. "Get out." But she couldn't. Her feet were rooted to the rast floor. She looked at his shaking form, at the blood welling on his knuckles where they had met the stone, at the sheer, desperate agony on his face. And for the first time, she saw past the king. She saw past the alpha, the curse, the monster. She saw a man in torment, utterly alone in his battle. And in that moment, something inside her, something deeper than fear, made a choice. He had called her an anchor, a key. She didn't know what it meant, didn't know if the seer's prophecy was truth or a desperate fable, but she knew that running would save her for a night, while he would be left to be consumed. She had been a runaway her whole life, running from the scorn of her pack, running from her unwanted mate, running from her own weakness. What if, for once, she stood her ground? Slowly, her hand trembling so badly she could barely control it, she reached out. She didn't know what she intended to do. Comfort him? Fight him? Her fingers brushed against the rough fabric of his tunic, over the hard, shaking muscle of his back. The second her skin touched him, a jolt went through them both. It was like touching a live wire. A white-hot surge of energy arced from him into her, so powerful it made her teeth ache and the hairs on her arms stand on end. His roar of pain and shock echoed in the chamber, but it wasn't a destructive force. It was wild, yes, but as it flowed into her, it felt familiar. It was the same overwhelming power he had pushed into her in the Great Hall, but 1,000 times stronger. It filled her, not burning her, but flowing through her, seeking something. It found the tiny, flickering ember of her wolf and engulfed it, not to extinguish it, but to feed it. The silver glow in her eyes brightened, a steady, luminous light. She felt the trembling in his body lessen. The guttural, constant growl in his chest subsided, replaced by his harsh, ragged breathing. He was still tense, still dangerous, but the immediate, violent pressure of the storm had broken. Hesitantly, she flattened her palm against his back. The connection deepened. She could feel the roiling chaos inside him, the battle between man and beast, and she could feel herself, somehow, standing in the middle of it, a point of stillness in the raging tempest. An anchor. Raphael sagged against the wall, the strength seeming to drain out of him all at once. He slowly, cautiously, turned his head, his wild, glowing eyes meeting hers. The feral red sparks were gone, leaving only a deep, exhausted gold. He stared at her hand on his back, then at her face, his expression one of raw, stunned disbelief. "How?" he breathed, the word a plume of steam in the cool air. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice trembling. She was terrified, but she didn't pull her hand away. They stood like that for a long moment, locked in a strange, fragile truce. The monster was sleeping. For now. The air slowly lost its electric charge. He was still the king. She was still his captive, bride, but something fundamental had shifted between them. He was not just her keeper. He was vulnerable to her. And she was not just his prisoner. She held a strange, terrifying power over his curse. He pushed himself away from the wall, standing straight with a visible effort. He looked down at her, his expression complex, a mixture of awe, resentment, and a profound, soul-deep weariness. He hated this, hated that she, this small Omega stranger, was the key to his sanity. "It seems," he said, his voice low and hoarse, "the seers were not wrong." Before Nora could find a reply, before she could begin to process the enormity of what had just happened, a frantic, heavy pounding rattled the chamber door. "Your Majesty!" a voice shouted, raw with urgency. "Your Majesty! You are needed!" Raphael's head snapped up, the weary man disappearing in an instant, replaced by the sharp, authoritative king. The shift was so sudden it was dizzying. "What is it?" he roared, his voice booming with command. "A rider from the Silver Creek pack is at the gates, Your Majesty," the guard yelled through the thick oak. "He carries the banner of their alpha. He demands an audience." Nora's blood went cold. Silver Creek. "What does he want?" Raphael demanded, his eyes narrowing, already sensing the answer. There was a hesitant pause, and then the guard's voice came back, strained with disbelief. "He claims his alpha's son Marcus is with him. He says you have stolen his son's bonded mate. He demands the return of Nora Halden." The guard's words slammed into Nora with the force of a physical blow. Silver Creek, Marcus, demands the return of Nora Halden. The name, the claim, was a key turning in a lock she thought she had escaped, threatening to drag her back into the cold, dark room of her past. Her breath hitched, a ragged, painful thing, all the fragile composure she had found, all the nascent strength she had felt in the king's presence, shattered into a million pieces. She was Nora of Silver Creek again, the wolfless Omega, the runaway property. Terror, pure and undiluted, was a freezing wave that swept over her. She could feel Marcus's phantom touch, the sneer in his voice, the crushing weight of his contempt. Her instincts, honed by a lifetime of submission and fear, screamed a single, desperate command. Hide. Raphael moved. He didn't look at her, but she felt the shift in his attention, the focus of his immense will turning from the internal battle with his curse to the external threat at his gates. The dangerous, feral energy that had been shaking his frame moments before did not vanish. Instead, it solidified, condensing from a chaotic storm into a blade of pure, cold rage. The golden light in his eyes cooled to a hard, unforgiving amber. The king was back in command. "They demand?" he repeated, his voice dangerously soft. The word was an insult, an absurdity he seemed to be tasting on his tongue. He walked, away from her, toward the center of the room, his movements fluid and predatory. An alpha of a provincial pack demands something of his king? He laughed, a short, harsh sound, utterly devoid of humor. It was the sound of a predator contemplating a particularly foolish piece of prey. He turned and his gaze fell upon her, huddled and trembling by the door. He saw her terror, the way she was shrinking into herself, and his expression hardened. "There will be no hiding," he said, his voice a flat, iron command. "You are a queen now. You will face them as one." "I can't," she whispered, the words stolen by her fear. He will take me back." Raphael crossed the room in 3 long strides, his power a tangible force that pushed her back against the door. He didn't touch her, but he loomed over her, his shadow engulfing her. "No one takes what is mine," he growled, the sound a low vibration in his chest that she felt in her own bones. "The contract is sealed. The moon has placed its mark upon you. Your old life is ash. Do you understand me?" She could only manage a terrified nod. "Good," he said, his voice clipping. "Elspeth will be here. She will find you something appropriate. You will not look like a frightened pup. You will look like a monarch. You will stand by my throne. You will not speak. And you will watch as I teach this Alpha Halden the price of insolence." He turned and strode to the door, pulling it open. The guards from the hallway snapped to attention. "Escort me to the throne room. Send for the captain of the guard. And bring Elspeth to the queen. Now." The guards scrambled to obey. Raphael was gone, a whirlwind of cold fury, leaving Nora alone in the sudden, ringing silence of the chamber. She was shaking so hard her teeth chattered. Face them? Stand by his throne? The thought was an impossibility. Her body screamed to run, to find a dark corner and disappear, but his orders echoed in her mind, trapping her as surely as any cage. Elspeth arrived moments later, her face a grim mask. If she knew the cause of the late-night summons, she gave no sign. She simply took in Nora's terrified state with a cool, disapproving glance. "His Majesty requires you," was all she said. She held up a gown. It was not velvet or silk, but a severe, almost martial dress of deep indigo wool, embroidered with the silver thread of the Dorn wolf on the high collar. It was the dress of a queen going to war, not to a feast. The process was swift and brutal. Elspeth dressed her with rough efficiency, her silence a judgment in itself. Her hands were cold as she pinned Nora's hair up, pulling it back so tightly from her face it made her scalp ache. There were no jewels this time, save for a single, heavy, silver ring bearing the king's snarling wolf sigil that Elspeth forced onto her finger. It was cold and heavy, a constant reminder of her bond. "Hold your head high," Elspeth commanded, giving Nora a final, critical look. "Whatever happens, you are a reflection of him. Do not show them fear. It will be a death sentence for you both." 2 different guards came for her this time. They were larger, clad in black iron armor, their faces hidden behind the visors of their helms. They were the king's personal guard, the elite, and their presence signaled the gravity of the situation. They escorted her through the silent, torchlit corridors, but instead of the great hall, they led her to a smaller, more intimidating chamber, the throne room. It was a place built for power and subjugation. The walls were dark, unadorned stone, the ceiling vaulted into shadow, far above. At the far end, on a high platform of black granite, sat the throne. It wasn't the ornate chair from the hall, but a true seat of power, carved from the heart of a single petrified ironwood tree, its back and arms twisted into the shapes of snarling wolves. King Raphael sat upon it, a figure of absolute immovable authority. He was not a man on a chair. He was a king fused to his throne. Captain Kalen stood at the foot of the dais, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword, his dark eyes missing nothing. A dozen of the black-armored royal guard lined the walls, silent as statues, their presence turning the room into a steel trap. The great bronze doors at the far end of the chamber were opened, and 2 figures were marched in, flanked by more guards. Nora's breath caught. The first was Alpha Gregor Halden, Marcus's father. He was a big man, broad and powerful, with a thick, gray-streaked beard and an air of stubborn, provincial pride. He walked with a belligerent swagger, his eyes scanning the intimidating room with a defiance that was clearly costing him. Behind him was Marcus. He looked just as she remembered, golden, handsome, and radiating an aura of cruel, arrogant privilege. His eyes found her instantly, and they narrowed with a look of pure, possessive fury. He saw her standing beside the king, wearing the royal colors, and his face contorted in a sneer. He looked at her as if she were a dog that had slipped its leash and needed to be beaten back into submission. The guards shoved them to a halt in the center of the room, a good 50 feet from the throne. The distance was a deliberate insult, forcing them to shout to be heard, emphasizing their lowly status. Alpha Halden. The king's voice boomed, the acoustics of the room amplifying it into a sound of raw, intimidating power. You are a long way from your dreary little patch of forest. To what do I owe this suicidal lack of judgment? Alpha Halden bristled at the insult. Your Majesty, he said, his voice tight with barely suppressed rage. I come here appealing to the old law. The law of the pack, the law of the moon. You have harbored a runaway. Worse, you have stolen a bonded mate. My son's mate. He gestured toward Nora. That girl belongs to my son, to my pack. The moon decreed it. The moon is not your pet, Halden, to be trotted out to justify your claims, Raphael said, his voice dangerously calm. The moon marks whom it pleases, and it has marked her as mine. Marcus could not contain himself. That is a lie, he shouted, his voice echoing in the stone chamber. She is a broken omega, a wolfless disgrace. You have bewitched her. That mark is a trick. He took a step forward, his eyes wild with fury, fixed on Nora. Nora! Tell them! Tell this usurper that you are mine! Your vow was to me! Every eye in the room turned to Nora, her heart hammered in her chest. This was it, the moment of confrontation. She could feel Marcus's will pushing at her, the force of their old, broken bond trying to reassert itself. It felt like a chain tightening around her throat. She looked at his furious, expectant face, and saw her entire future of misery laid out before her. Then she felt the king's presence beside her, a wall of unyielding power. He didn't look at her, but she could feel his command, his expectation. Be a fortress. She had a choice. A terrible, terrifying choice. A life of certain misery with Marcus, or a life of uncertain danger with the king and his curse. She remembered the feeling of his power flowing into her, awakening her wolf. She remembered him shattering stone to keep from hurting her. It was a brutal, terrifying kind of protection, but it was protection nonetheless. Marcus had only ever offered her a cage. Slowly, deliberately, she met Marcus's gaze. She let him see the fear in her eyes, but she let him see the flicker of defiance behind it. She found her voice, and though it trembled, it did not break. There was no vow, she said, the words falling like stones into the silence. I did not accept the bond. Marcus stared at her, his jaw dropping in disbelief, which quickly curdled into rage. You lie! You ungrateful bitch! After all my father has done for your worthless family. Silence. Raphael's roar was the crack of a thunderclap, shaking the very stones of the room. He rose slowly from his throne, a mountain of contained violence. You are in my hall, speaking to my queen. You will choose your next words as if your life depends on them, because it does. He descended the steps of the dais, his movements deliberate and deadly. He stopped beside Nora, and for the second time, took her hand. His grip was like iron. He pulled her forward to stand with him in the center of the platform, facing her accusers. You speak of vows and bonds, the king said, his voice a low, lethal growl. But you are blind. The girl you knew is gone. A new bond has been forged, one that supersedes your pathetic provincial claim. I do not believe you, Alpha Halden spat. Show me this bond. Show me a mark that can override the will of the moon as witnessed by an entire pack. Raphael looked down at Nora. His amber eyes held a silent, urgent question. He was giving her the stage. He was forcing her to claim her own fate. He could destroy them with a word, but that would leave her a protected victim. He wanted her to be a participant. He wanted her to choose. She understood. With her heart in her throat, she took a deep breath. She reached up with her free hand and pulled down the high, stiff collar of her gown, exposing her shoulder, exposing the mark. At first, it was faint, a mere tracery of silver lines on her pale skin, but then, as Marcus and his father stared, it began to glow. It started as a soft, pearlescent shimmer, like moonlight on water. Then the glow intensified, pulsing with a bright, silver-white light that seemed to emanate from within her very bones. It was not the king's power making it glow. It was hers. It was the moon's. It was the mark of their true, undeniable bond, responding to the challenge, defending its claim. A collective gasp came from the guards lining the walls. "Captain," Kaelin's eyes widened. Alpha Halden staggered back as if struck, his face a mask of shocked disbelief. Marcus, however, was beyond reason. Seeing the glowing mark, the ultimate proof that he had lost her, sent him into a feral rage. "No!" he screamed, his features contorting as his wolf surged forward. His eyes bled to a predatory gold, his canines elongating. With a snarl, he broke free from the guards holding him and lunged, not at the king, but at Nora. He reached for her, his hand clawed, intending to rip her away, to physically reclaim what he saw as his. He never touched her. The moment his fingers came within a foot of her skin, the glowing mark on her shoulder exploded with light. A wave of pure, silver energy, cold as the heart of winter, erupted from her. It was not a violent force, but an absolute one. It struck Marcus square in the chest. He was not thrown back. He was simply stopped, frozen in place for a heart-stopping second before he crumpled to the floor, gasping and clutching his chest as if the very air had been stolen from his lungs. The silver light had not harmed him, but it had utterly rejected him, the power of a true bond casting out a false one. He lay on the stone floor, gasping and broken, his shift receding, leaving him looking pathetic and small. The throne room was utterly silent. The proof was undeniable, a miracle and a judgment enacted before their eyes. Raphael looked down at the whimpering whelp on the floor, then to the pale, stunned face of Alpha Halden. His expression was merciless. "You have your proof, Halden," the king said, his voice like the grinding of glaciers. "You have entered my home, challenged my authority, and insulted my queen. You and your son have threatened the stability of this realm with your arrogance. There can be only one sentence for such treason." He raised his hand. "Captain Kaelin, strip them of their rank and their lands. They are no longer Alpha and Heir. They are Omega, cast out. Exile them to the northern wastes. They will live out their days in the cold, and if they ever set foot in the southern territories again, they will be hunted down like the rogue dogs they are." "Your Majesty, no," Halden pleaded, his pride finally shattering. "Mercy, mercy," the king repeated, the word sounding like a foreign curse. He looked down at Nora, at her pale, shaken face, at the silver light of the mark slowly fading on her shoulder. "You showed her no mercy. You will receive none from me." He turned back to his captain. "Take them, now." The guards dragged the broken Alpha and his son away, their pleas and curses echoing until the great bronze doors boomed shut, leaving a profound and ringing silence in their wake. Nora stood trembling, the adrenaline draining away, leaving her weak and dizzy. It was over. Her past had come for her, and it had been destroyed. Raphael turned to her. He was still holding her hand, his thumb stroking slowly over her knuckles. He looked from her face to the mark on her shoulder, now just a faint silver tracing once more. His amber eyes were dark, intense, and held an expression she had never seen before, something that went beyond possession, beyond the needs of his curse. It was a look of raw, stark assessment, as if he were seeing her, truly seeing her, for the first time. He lifted his other hand and gently, almost hesitantly, traced the outline of the mark on her shoulder with his finger. His touch was not hot like it had been before. It was warm, questioning, a spark of electricity that made her shiver. "The moon has chosen," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur. "And so have you." He leaned in closer, his scent of cedar and smoke, and the faint, lingering ozone of his power surrounding her. His lips were inches from her ear. "There is no running now, Nora. Not for either of us." The aftermath of the confrontation was a strange, hollow silence. The throne room, emptied of its drama, felt vast and cold. Nora stood on the granite dais, the king's hand still holding hers, his thumb a slow, rhythmic caress against her skin that was both grounding and deeply unsettling. Her past had been tried, sentenced, and exiled in the space of a heartbeat. She should have felt relief, a sense of liberation. Instead, she felt a profound, bone-deep exhaustion, and the unnerving awareness that one cage had simply been replaced by another, infinitely larger and more gilded. Raphael finally released her hand. He turned and ascended the steps to his ironwood throne, sinking into it not like a triumphant king, but like a weary man setting down a crushing weight. He gestured to Captain Kalen, who had been watching them with his usual unreadable expression. "Double the patrols on the Silver Creek border," the king commanded, his voice rough with fatigue. "Send word to the neighboring alphas. The Halden line is broken. Their territory is now under royal jurisdiction. Until a new alpha can be vetted, I want no opportunists." "It will be done, Your Majesty," Kalen said with a crisp bow. His dark eyes flicked to Nora for a fraction of a second, a glance that held a new, cautious respect. Then he and the remaining guards exited, their footsteps echoing until the great doors closed, leaving Nora and the king alone once more. The silence that fell was different from the one in their chambers. It was less charged with danger, more filled with the weight of unspoken things. The events of the night had changed everything. She was no longer just a contract bride, a component in a prophecy. She had acted. She had chosen. The bond, and the strange power that came with it, had proven itself real. "You are bleeding," Nora said, her voice sounding small in the vastness of the hall. He looked down at his hand, the one that had met the stone wall in his chamber. The knuckles were split and raw, a dark line of blood tracing a path across his skin. He seemed to notice it for the first time, flexing his fingers with a detached curiosity. "It will heal," he said, dismissing it. But Nora found herself walking toward him. She didn't know why. Every instinct for self-preservation told her to keep her distance, to retreat to the safety of her assigned role. But she had seen his agony, his desperate fight for control. She had been the anchor for his storm, and now she saw the simple, physical evidence of his pain. She stopped at the foot of his throne, looking up at him. "It should be cleaned," she insisted, her voice gaining a sliver of confidence. A flicker of surprise crossed his face. No one, she suspected, told the king what to do. He studied her for a long moment, his amber eyes searching her face, trying to decipher this small act of defiance, of concern. Finally, he gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. He held out his hand. Hesitantly, she mounted the steps of the dais. She took a clean embroidered handkerchief from a hidden pocket in her gown, a habit from a lifetime of cleaning up others' messes, and gently took his large, scarred hand in hers. His skin was hot, his calluses rough against her fingertips. She carefully, delicately, began to wipe away the blood. He sat perfectly still, watching her. His gaze was so intense it felt like a physical touch, tracing the line of her bowed head, the nervous tremble in her fingers, the focused line of her mouth. The silence stretched, filled only by the whisper of linen against skin. "You could have let them take you," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You could have claimed the bond with him was true. I would not have stopped you." She didn't look up from her task. "Yes, you would have," she replied, her voice quiet but firm. "You said it yourself. No one takes what is yours." A dark, humorless smile touched his lips. "No, no one does. But the choice was still yours to make." "He would have hurt me," she whispered, the simple, honest truth. She finished cleaning the wound, the raw skin now stark and angry against the surrounding flesh. "He would have broken me." "And you think I will not?" he asked, the question sharp, brutal. Her hands stilled. She finally lifted her head, her gaze meeting his. She looked into his tormented, powerful eyes. She thought of the shattered stone beside her head, of the feral rage he had fought to contain. She thought of the cold, calculating way he had used her in the great hall. "You might," she said, her voice shaking slightly but holding steady. "You might break me, but it won't be because you are cruel. It will be because you are broken too." The raw honesty of her words struck him silent. The mask of the king fell away, and for a fleeting, breathtaking moment, she saw the man beneath. She saw the centuries of pain, the crushing loneliness of his power, the terrible burden of the beast that lived inside him. The scar on his temple seemed to stand out, a stark reminder of a life defined by violence. He pulled his hand from her grasp, not with anger, but with a deep, shuddering weariness. He leaned his head back against the ironwood throne and closed his eyes. "My mother," he said, his voice so low she had to lean in to hear it, "was an anchor, like you. She was a gentle soul from a southern pack, chosen for her strength of spirit. She tempered my father's rage for 20 years. She held his beast at bay." He opened his eyes, but they weren't looking at her. They were looking into the past. And then she died. And the beast my father had kept chained for 2 decades broke free. He ruled for 3 more years. 3 years of blood and terror. He almost destroyed the kingdom he had built. He paused, his throat working. "I was 17 when I was forced to kill him, to put the monster down. I took his throne, and I inherited his curse. A curse that has grown stronger with every generation." He finally looked at her, and his eyes were filled with a bleak, desolate emptiness. "That is what this is, Nora. That is what you have been bound to. Not a king, a monster in waiting. I spend every moment of my life holding back the storm. And some days the tide is too strong." Nora's heart ached with a pain she didn't understand. It was pity, yes, but it was something more. It was a terrifying, unwelcome flicker of empathy, of connection. She was bound to this man not just by a contract or a mark, but by his deepest, most defining wound. "When you touched me," he said, his voice raw, "in the chamber, the rage, it quieted. It felt the way the wind stills before dawn. It's the first time I have felt that kind of peace since I was a child." He looked at her with a desperate, hungry intensity. "The seers said the anchor would not just ground the king, but heal the line. That your blood held a key. I thought it was a metaphor, a prophecy about an heir. What if it isn't?" she whispered. His gaze dropped to the faint mark on her shoulder, then back to her face. "That is a hope I dare not entertain." He rose from the throne, the moment of vulnerability passing, the king's mantle settling back over him, but the wall between them was not as high as it had been. A crack had formed. "Come," he said, his voice returning to its familiar, commanding tone, though a new, rougher edge of emotion lingered beneath it. "The night is almost over. You need to rest." He led her from the throne room, not holding her hand this time, but walking beside her, a subtle but significant shift. He was no longer just her keeper, dragging her along. They were walking the same path. When they returned to their chambers, the air was different. The raw, violent tension was gone, replaced by a fragile, uncertain peace. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the room was filled with soft shadows. Nora stopped in the middle of the room, suddenly unsure of what to do, of where she was supposed to go. There was only one bed. Raphael seemed to understand her hesitation. He walked to a large, carved wardrobe and pulled out a thick fur blanket. He tossed it onto a long, cushioned chaise lounge that sat near the fireplace. "You will be safe," he said, his back to her. It was a promise, and it was a dismissal. He was giving her space, a gift she hadn't expected. She watched as he began to strip off his formal tunic, his movements stiff and weary. He unbuckled his sword belt, laying the weapon carefully on a table. When he turned, he was bare-chested, the firelight gleaming on the incredible tapestry of scars that covered his torso. Each mark was a story of survival, a testament to the violence that had forged him. He saw her staring, but for the first time, he didn't seem to care. The pretense was gone. He was who he was, broken, scarred, and dangerous. He walked to the massive bed and lay down on his side, facing away from her, pulling a sheet over his hips but leaving his back and shoulders bare. The sheer size of him dwarfed the bed. He lay perfectly still, but she knew he wasn't sleeping. She could feel the steady, powerful thrum of his presence, a low, constant hum at the edge of her senses. It was no longer a terrifying, chaotic storm, but a deep, powerful ocean in a moment of calm. Nora curled up on the chaise lounge, pulling the heavy fur over her. It was surprisingly soft and smelled faintly of him, cedar and smoke. It should have been alarming, but instead, it was strangely comforting. She lay in the quiet darkness, listening to the soft crackle of the embers and the sound of his slow, steady breathing. Her entire world had been upended in the space of a single day. She had run from her life, been bound to a king, faced down her tormentors, and held a monster at bay. She was no longer Nora of Silver Creek. She was Nora of House Dorn, queen of a kingdom she did not know, wife to a man she was only just beginning to understand. As she drifted on the edge of sleep, a memory surfaced. The feel of his power, the real power of the bond, erupting from her to repel Marcus. It had been the moon's power, the bond's power, but it had come through her. It had felt like a muscle she never knew she had, flexing for the first time. For her entire life, she had been told she was wolfless, weak, an empty vessel. But the king's curse, his terrifying, untamed power, had not broken her. It had awakened something inside her. Lying in the quiet dark of the king's chamber, Nora realized a startling, terrifying truth. Duchess Isolde had been right to fear her. The court had been right to be wary. She was not the empty, broken thing they all believed her to be. She was the key. She was the anchor. And she was beginning to suspect that anchoring the king's storm was not her only purpose. Perhaps her true destiny was to learn how to wield a storm of her own. 2 winters had passed since the night. Alpha Halden had been exiled. 2 years since the whispers in the court had turned from scorn to a wary, grudging awe. The wind that blew from the churning gray sea still carried the scent of salt and storm. But to Nora, it no longer felt like a threat. It felt like home. She stood on the stone balcony of the royal chambers, the cool morning air a gentle kiss against her skin. She was no longer the girl who flinched at every shadow. That girl was a ghost, a memory of a life that belonged to someone else. In her arms, a small, warm bundle stirred, a soft sound of contentment breaking the morning's peace. She looked down at her son, at the tuft of dark hair on his head so like his father's, and the peaceful, sleeping curve of his mouth. Leo. He was 6 months old, a solid, healthy child, whose presence had brought a light into the ancient, shadowed castle that no torch ever could. He was the future. He was the proof. His small hand, perfect and unblemished, curled around her finger. She felt the faint, steady thrum of his life force, clean and bright, and utterly untouched by the centuries-old shadow that had haunted his father's line. The curse had ended here. With him, with them, a pair of strong arms encircled her from behind, and a familiar, grounding warmth enveloped her. Raphael rested his chin on her shoulder, his gaze fixed on their son. The scent of him cedar and smoke, and the clean scent of the sea was the scent of safety, of belonging. His presence was a constant, low thrum against her senses, no longer a terrifying storm, but a deep, steady ocean tide, its rhythm matched to her own. "He has your eyes," Raphael murmured, his voice a low, soft rumble against her ear. It was a voice she had come to know in all its registers, from the iron command of a king to the raw, agonized growl of a man fighting his beast, to this, the quiet, tender whisper of a husband. Nora smiled, leaning her head back against his chest. "He has your stubborn chin." He was different now. The coiled, violent tension that had once defined him had eased. It was not gone. The beast was a part of him, always would be, but it was no longer his master. It was a wolf that walked at his side, not one that clawed at him from within. The deep lines of pain around his eyes had softened. He still wore his scars with the pride of a survivor, but he no longer wore his crown like a sentence. Their bond had deepened beyond anything she could have imagined. It was more than a conduit for his rage. It was a silent language, a shared space where their thoughts and emotions could meet without words. In the long nights, when the memory of his past and the weight of his kingdom pressed in on him, she would reach for him, her touch a quiet anchor that stilled the rising tide of his power. And he, in turn, had become her fortress, his unwavering belief in her strength teaching her to believe in it herself. Her own wolf, once a timid whisper, was now a calm, steady presence within her. It had been his power that had first awakened it, but it had been his trust that had allowed it to heal. She was not a mighty alpha wolf, full of fire and dominance. She was an omega, and she had finally learned what that truly meant. Not weakness, but a different kind of strength. A quiet, resilient power that could absorb and soothe and endure, the strength of the roots that hold the great oak, of the shore that contains the raging sea. "The court is assembled," he said, though he made no move to leave. "The emissaries from the Sunstone packs have arrived. They are impatient to see the heir." "Let them wait," Nora said, her voice soft but firm. She turned in his arms to face him, cradling Leo between them. They waited 2 years to accept their queen. They can wait a morning to see their prince. A slow, genuine smile touched his lips, a sight that still made her heart ache with a fierce, protective love. "The court fears you more than they. Fear me now, you know." It was true. After the night with Marcus Halden, no one had dared to challenge her openly again, but her power had not been cemented by that single, explosive display of the moon's will. It had been built in the days and months that followed. It was in the quiet way she advised Raphael, her insights often cutting through the bluster of his generals. It was in the unwavering loyalty she earned from the castle staff, who had once looked at her with contempt but now saw a queen who knew their names and understood their burdens. Duchess Isolde, after a humiliating and public apology, had been relegated to her country estates, her ambitions broken against the quiet, immovable wall of the new queen's grace. Nora reached up, her fingers gently tracing the jagged scar on his temple. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, a question she had never dared to voice before. "The contract. Binding yourself to a stranger, a runaway?" He captured her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm, then holding it against his heart. His amber eyes, no longer burning with a feral curse but glowing with a warm, steady light, held hers. "My entire life was a battle, Nora. Against my enemies, against my father's legacy, against myself. I was the king of ash and embers, ruling a kingdom I was destined to burn." He leaned down and pressed his forehead against hers, the warmth of their sun a living bridge between them. "You were not the end of my fight," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer hid from her. "You were the reason to win it. You are not my anchor, my love. You are my harbor, my peace." He kissed her then, a slow, deep kiss that tasted of love and loyalty, and 1,000 shared battles, both seen and unseen. It was a vow renewed, not in blood and desperation, but in tenderness and truth. When he pulled away, he looked down at their son, a look of profound wonder on his harsh, beautiful face. "The seers said your blood would heal the line," he said softly. They were right. Together, they walked back into the chamber from the balcony, the morning sun streaming in through the great windows, banishing the last of the shadows. The room that had once been her prison was now her sanctuary. The man who had been her captor was the other half of her soul. She was not a pawn in fate's game. She had been the queen destiny had hidden all along, waiting for a king strong enough not to command her, but to finally set her free. They stood for a moment in the warm sunlight, a family forged in fire and prophecy, their kingdom peaceful, their future bright and stretching before them. The Alpha King, his Omega Queen, and the prince who was the dawn of a new reign. And in the quiet peace of the morning, they knew, with a certainty that settled deep in their bones, that their story was, at long last, complete.